She's renowned as the favoured wife of Henry VIII, the woman who displaced Anne Boleyn in his affections, and the mother of his longed-for son, Edward VI. But who was the real Jane Seymour? Was she actually as mild as she seemed, or was she more cunning and dangerous than history has allowed? Let's find out. Jane Seymour was born in around 1508 or 1509, probably at her family seat, Whitehall in Wiltshire. Sadly though, the original house has long since been lost, and so I am unable to show it to you. She was the fifth child but eldest daughter of the 10 children of Sir John Seymour, a soldier and courtier, and his wife Marjorie Wentworth. The Seymours were a very respectable family who could claim descent from Edward III, but they were not in the upper echelons of English society, and no one would ever have suspected that one of their daughters would become the Queen of England. Unfortunately, we know remarkably little about Jane's early life or her education. We can extrapolate from later evidence, though, that she must have been reasonably well educated. She could evidently read and write, and she would have been raised a Catholic. An ambassador would speak to her in French during her queenship, which suggests that she spoke it well enough to pass herself in conversation. She was also most likely taught how to dance in preparation for court life, and how to sew. In 1652, an inventory of the goods of William, Marquess of Hertford, included several pieces of needlework, such as cushions, which were said to have been wrought by Jane's own hand. Still, in comparison to Henry's first 2 wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, Jane's education was modest. She first appeared at court in around 1529, when she was brought in as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine. When that queen was set aside in favour of Anne, though, Jane remained in post and was simply transferred to the new consort's household. Like Anne, who had been one of Catherine's ladies, she had therefore been in the periphery of Henry's vision for several years before he took any serious notice of her. When exactly he began to court her, though, remains unclear. One theory is that it was as early as October 1534, when the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote that the king was attached to some unnamed young lady who was a supporter of his long-suffering daughter by Catherine, Princess Mary. Barrett L. Beer, writing in the Oxford DMB, is of the opinion that this can have been no one but Jane. Other writers are more sceptical, though, and we have to consider whether Henry and Jane could have carried on a relationship which had begun so early, and yet Jane's name not make it into the public sphere until early 1536. Henry visited her family at Whitehall in October 1535, right around the point that Anne became pregnant for the last time, and while we don't know if that is when Mistress Seymour caught his attention in a romantic way, a date of late 1535 or the very beginning of 1536 does seem more likely for the start of their relationship. Certainly Anne was complaining that she was heartbroken because she saw that he loved others by the end of January 1536, and Jane's name first appears in one of Chapuis's letters on the 17th of February, though he got it wrong and called her Mistress Semmel. What was it that Henry saw in this woman, though, who at about 27 years old was already considered a little aged by Tudor court standards? Jane's most famous portrait is this one by court artist Hans Holbein the Younger, and it was likely painted in 1537. It shows her in a red dress, a modest English-style gable hood which covers her hair, and wearing the Tudor consort necklace she had inherited from Anne, plus a large brooch with the initials IHS, short for Jesus Hominum Salvator, meaning Jesus, Saviour of Mankind. She has a long nose, slightly pursed lips, and a little double chin, though she may have already been pregnant when this painting was commissioned. She does not appear to have been a great beauty, and only Henry's friends, like Sir John Russell, called her fair, saying she was the best-looking of the king's wives. The more impartial Chapuis said she was of middle stature, and nobody thinks she has much beauty. Her complexion is so whitish that she may be called rather pale. She wasn't particularly intelligent either, he said, calling her a woman of little wit who was proud and haughty. He could only assume Henry was after her for some very unchivalrous reasons. What she did have, though, was a personality diametrically opposed to Anne Boleyn's. Sir John Russell said that she is as gentle a lady as I ever knew, and as fair a queen as any in Christendom. She cultivated an image of innocent, virginal, pious submissiveness then, but to what extent was this true? Let's now turn to exactly how Jane Seymour became Queen of England in place of Anne Boleyn. Anne's position at the start of 1536 was actually still quite secure, for she was pregnant again. On the 7th of January, though, Catherine of Aragon died, and on the 29th of that month, Anne lost the son she had been carrying. From here on out, things moved very rapidly. By mid-February, Chapuis was gossiping that Henry had latterly made very valuable presents to Jane, and on the 18th of March, he told a correspondent that the new amours of this king with the young lady of whom I have before written still go on, to the intense rage of the concubine, that's Anne, and the king 15 days ago put into his chamber the young lady's brother. This brother was Edward Seymour, future Duke of Somerset, and later writers have built on these tales to describe a love triangle in the Queen's household as Anne fought to keep her husband. A story written by the exiled Catholic recusant Nicholas Sander and published in the 1580s says that whilst still pregnant, Anne had walked in on Jane sitting on the king's knee. This led to a blazing row between the royal couple, and to Anne blaming her miscarriage on the actions of Henry and Jane, who she called an abandoned woman. Given that Chapuis says that Anne knew Henry was paying court to other women, something of this nature may have occurred, but we don't know for sure, and Sander's work is filled with known and sometimes quite egregious inaccuracies. For one famous example, see my video on whether Anne had a sixth finger on one hand. In the memoirs of Jane Dormer, Duchess of Ferrier, a woman only born in 1538 and whose biography was written up after her death by someone else, it was reported that Anne and Jane had engaged in much scratching and bye-blows over Jane's relationship with Henry, while Thomas Fuller's The History of the Worthies of England, published in 1662, said that Anne had ripped a pendant off Jane's neck containing Henry's picture and injured her hand in the process. Like Sander, these sources are of very dubious veracity, as discussed in my video on whether Anne attacked Jane, which I'll leave linked for you. Also linked below is my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get a free download when you sign up to my mailing list, which will give you 5 simple ways to spot well-written versus badly written history, so that you can hopefully avoid books as bad as Sander's. Even if the stories he and the others told are true, though, they still don't tell us much about Jane's personality, or whether she was encouraging or simply enduring Henry's attentions. As time went on, though, it became evident that Jane was very much aiming to displace Anne. On the 1st of April, Chapuis reported to his boss, Emperor Charles V of Spain, an incident which had occurred a few days earlier, so in late March, saying, "The king being here in London, and the young Miss Seymour, to whom he is paying court at Greenwich, he sent her a purse full of sovereigns, together with a letter, and that the young damsel to whom he is paying court, after respectfully kissing the letter, returned it to the messenger without opening it, and then falling on her knees, begged the royal messenger to entreat the king in her name to consider that she was a well-born damsel, the daughter of good and honourable parents, without blame or reproach of any kind. There was no treasure in this world that she valued as much as her honour, and on no account would she lose it, even if she were to die 1,000 deaths. That if the king wished to make her a present of money, she requested him to reserve it for such a time as God would be pleased to send her some advantageous marriage." If we're being generous here, we could say that Jane was in earnest at this point and trying to disentangle herself from Henry, but if so, Chapuis never suspected as much. This was the same way in which Anne had dealt with Henry nearly a decade earlier, refusing to become his mistress and instead holding out for marriage, and once again the tactic worked a treat. Chapuis's source also told him that, in consequence of this refusal, the king's love for the said damsel had marvellously increased, and that he had said to her that not only did he praise and commend her virtuous behaviour on the occasion, but that in order to prove the sincerity of his love and the honesty of his views towards her, he had resolved not to converse with her in future except in the presence of one of her relatives, and that for this reason the king had taken away from Master Cromwell's apartments in the palace a room, to which he can, when he likes, have access through certain galleries without being seen, of which room the young lady's elder brother and his wife have already taken possession for the express purpose of her repairing thither. Unlike Anne, who seems to have taken the lead in her management of Henry back in the day, because no, her family weren't pimping her out, that's just a plot line from a Philippa Gregory novel and the TV show The Tudors, Jane was getting help, and she was to some extent a pawn, willing or otherwise, of those around her who were Anne's enemies. Chapuis had heard that the young lady has been well tutored and warned by those among this king's courtiers who hate the concubine, telling her not in any ways to give in to the king's fancy unless he makes her his queen, upon which the damsel is quite resolved. She has likewise been advised to tell the king frankly and without reserve how much his subjects abominate the marriage contracted with the concubine, and that not one considers it legitimate, and that this declaration ought to be made in the presence of witnesses of the titled nobility of this kingdom, who are to attest the truth of her statements should the king request them on their oath and fealty to do so. Chapuis, whose main concern was the well-being of Princess Mary, whom Anne had a very poor relationship with, and for the security of the Catholic Church in England, was delighted at this turn of events and eager to help if he could. For her part, Jane does not seem to have been resisting the plot to oust Anne, and I can't help but think that she wasn't as meek and pious as she might have made out. Her family can only have been delighted with her rise as well, for it lifted them too, as her brother Edward's elevation to the Privy Chamber in March had already showed. News of the relationship had leaked beyond the court as well, and Henry had to warn Jane to pay no mind to a pamphlet circulating about them, telling her in an undated letter written during the latter part of their courtship, when she had evidently conceded to being called his mistress, that, "My dear friend and mistress, the bearer of these few lines from thy entirely devoted servant will deliver into thy fair hands a token of my true affection for thee, hoping you will keep it forever in your sincere love for me. Advertising you that there is a ballad made lately of great derision against us, which if it go much abroad and is seen by you, I pray you to pay no manner of regard to it. I am not at present informed who is the setter forth of this malignant writing, but if he is found out, he shall be straitly punished for it. For the things ye lacked, I have minded my lord to supply them to you as soon as he can buy them. Thus hoping shortly to receive you in these arms, I end for the present your own loving servant and sovereign, H.R." Henry, in fact, never did find out who had written the ballad, fortunately for them. By the start of May, Anne's fate was all but sealed. She was arrested on the 2nd, and, along with her brother and several other friends, was charged with treason and adultery, and, in the case of the Boleyn siblings, incest. The men were convicted first, then after a show trial on the 17th, because there was no way she could be found innocent when they'd already been found guilty, Anne was convicted too and sentenced to death. She was executed within the grounds of the Tower of London on the 19th, and buried in the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Jane had been housed during this time, first at Beddington, the home of Sir Nicholas Carew, near Croydon, then at Chelsea, near Whitehall, from the 14th of May onwards. At both places she was, quote, "splendidly served" by the king's servants and fabulously dressed as befitted her station as the Queen in waiting. As soon as Anne was dead, Henry went to visit her, and now that the way was clear for him to marry again, he wasted no time. He and Jane were officially betrothed at either Chelsea or Whitehall, sources differ, the very next day, having been issued with a dispensation from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, on account of them being fifth cousins, and, given the wording of the dispensation, apparently because one of Henry's mistresses at some point must have been a second cousin of Jane's, though we don't know who that part of the dispensation referred to. The speed with which this had all happened did not go unnoticed, nor was it universally well thought of. On the same day as the engagement, Chapuis wrote that everybody begins already to murmur by suspicion, and several affirm that long before the death of the other there was some arrangement which sounds ill in the ears of the people. Even the unpopular Anne could garner some sympathy when her treatment was this bad, and perhaps Chapuis had seen the ballad of great derision as well. Nevertheless, the wedding went ahead at Whitehall Palace on the 30th of May. Henry had come out of hell into heaven, wrote Sir John Russell, for Jane, and not Anne, was now the Queen of England. Before we get to Jane's queenship, please remember to give this video a like so that YouTube knows you approve, and for more from me, hit the subscribe button too with the notification bell switched on. You can also find me on Patreon, where I share bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, and recommendations for other great history content on the web, and I have an Amazon storefront too, where I provide curated lists of history-themed movies, TV shows, books, and gifts. Both are linked below for you, as is my Instagram account. The marriage had been quiet and private, as most of Henry's weddings were, but Jane was introduced at court during the Whitsuntide festivities, and Londoners got their first look at the new queen in June, when she began accompanying Henry to official engagements. She chose as her motto the words "bound to obey and serve." This was a stark contrast to one of Anne's mottos, which had been "this is how it's going to be, let them grumble," and indicates the two women's very different attitudes to queenship, marriage to Henry, and how they wanted to present themselves to the public. Anne's falcon badges were also quickly replaced with Jane's. She was all docile sweetness, it seemed, but as the Queen, politics almost immediately made an entrance into her life. Eustace Chapuis told her that he hoped she would deserve the title of pacifier by bringing Princess Mary back into the fold. Mary was indeed reconciled to her father very soon after the third wedding, but only after she had capitulated to his wishes, meaning she had to admit that his marriage to her mother was unlawful, she was illegitimate, and Henry was the head of the church in England. Jane's influence in this rapprochement is unclear, but there is a story that she petitioned for Mary prior to her marriage, only for Henry to snap at her that, quote, she ought to study the welfare and exaltation of her own children, if she had any by him, instead of looking out for the good of others. Jane's response was that, in soliciting the princess's reinstatement, she thought she was asking for the good, the repose and tranquillity of himself, of the children they themselves might have, and of the kingdom in general. She was clearly able enough to handle Henry, even on her own, and without coming across as being as abrasive as Anne had been. She got along with Mary far better than her predecessor too, and made her a present of a diamond ring when she and the king visited the 20-year-old on the 6th of July at Hackney near Hunsdon, where Mary was then staying. The gifts from Queen Jane to her new stepdaughter would continue throughout her time as consort, and Mary was the second lady of the court after Jane. Little Elizabeth, daughter of Anne, was not forgotten either. Though now illegitimate like her sister and temporarily forgotten about in the wake of the new marriage, she literally ran out of clothes at one point now that Anne wasn't sending them anymore, she was still present at court in the autumn of 1536 and, according to one French observer, was treated with affection by her father, who loved her very much. The royal couple's early marriage was largely taken up with a royal progress, which saw them visit locations including Canterbury and Dover Castle. There were also plans to have Jane crowned, as Henry's first two wives had been. An outbreak of plague put the brakes on this event though, and in the end she would never have a coronation, nor in fact would her three successors. There were other problems in the country too, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace, which kicked off that October. The pilgrimage was, very briefly, an uprising sparked by Henry's dissolution of the monasteries, his promotion of the English Bible, the eradication of things like feast days, and the loss of Mary as his heir. As well as rectifying these issues, those in rebellion also demanded that Henry have new councillors to advise him, with a trip to the block for some of the old ones. It took place in the north of England, and one of its most notable participants was a man named Robert Aske, who led a procession of 40,000 people into the city of York. Some aristocrats joined in the uprising, though many would later claim that they had been forced to do so, including Catherine Parr's second husband, Lord Latimer. See my video on her life before marriage to Henry to hear more about her terrifying experience of the pilgrimage. Henry did not take well to his authority being challenged, but he was persuaded to issue a general pardon to all involved in December, though when a second round of rebellion broke out in February, he initiated a brutal policy of repression which led to hundreds, if not thousands, of executions across the north, including of Aske, who had only recently been at court, seemingly forgiven, for the Christmas celebrations. But where was Jane in all of this? Well, she was a Catholic, remember, not a Lutheran like Anne, and she had begged her husband from her knees to restore the abbeys. He gave her a chilling rebuke for her trouble, telling her not to meddle in his affairs and reminding her what had happened to the last queen who had done so. Jane wisely backed off, knowing that such a threat from Henry needed to be taken very seriously. She was unlike Anne in other ways too, courting the friendship of Chapuis and telling him that she encouraged Henry to maintain an alliance with Spain rather than France. Even her ladies were not to wear the French clothing associated with Anne, for Jane was a fairly strict mistress when it came to her household, and she told them to embrace the more modest English apparel. The most important way in which she was to differ from her predecessor, though, was in her childbirth record. In the midst of all the drama stemming from the pilgrimage, Jane suffered both a great loss and made a great gain. Her father died on the 21st of December 1536, though she does not appear to have left court to attend the funeral. And then, just a matter of weeks later, she conceived. It was 7 months into the marriage, and it must have been a relief to all, given the rumours already in circulation since at least the trial of Anne Boleyn and her co-accused about Henry's performance in the bedroom. And in fact, this would be the last time we know of that he ever impregnated a woman, despite 3 further marriages after Jane. The pregnancy progressed well, with a craving for quail eggs one of its symptoms, and by the 23rd of May, the happy news was widely known about in the court, and a Te Deum was sung in thanks for the impending arrival in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 27th. On the 16th of September, Jane took to her chamber at Hampton Court Palace to await the birth. She went into labour on the 10th of October, and it was long. It was not until 2 a.m. on the 12th that she was finally delivered, but it had been worth the wait. The baby was a healthy boy. Henry finally had his heir, and he was ecstatic. The child was named Edward, for it was the eve of the feast of St. Edward the Confessor. There were celebrations all over the city, including bonfires, another Te Deum at St. Paul's, and every other London church as well, plus free food and wine and a gun salute from the Tower of London. On the 15th, little Edward was christened in the chapel at Hampton Court with his 2 sisters in attendance, while his mother continued to recuperate in her bedchamber, and his uncle, Edward Seymour, was made an earl. The world must have seemed perfect for a moment for Jane and her family. Then came disaster. Despite initially seeming to recover from the birth, so much so that there were already plans for her churching after 30 days so that she could return to normal life, Jane was in fact succumbing to postpartum complications. It's impossible at such a distance to say precisely what happened, but possibly she retained part of the placenta, leading to infection, or contracted puerperal fever. By the 19th, there were processions and prayers at St. Paul's for her health, and on the 23rd she suffered what was called a lax, for which read hemorrhage. This might have been the placenta discharging. At first this seemed to help, but it quickly became clear there was no helping Jane. She deteriorated during the night, and on the following day, at about midnight on the 24th of October, she died at Hampton Court, still aged only about 28 or 29. We don't know if Henry was there or not. After lying in state and a grand funeral, she was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 13th of November, with her stepdaughter Mary as the chief mourner, it not being traditional for a monarch to attend a funeral. When the time came in 1547, Henry joined her, making her the only one of his wives with whom he is buried. In the following century, it also became the resting place of one of the infant children of Queen Anne Stuart and Charles I. Henry never got around to erecting a great tomb for Jane or himself, and nor did his children, so the marker in the floor was only added in centuries later by William IV. I have an entire video just on Jane's death and burial, which I recommend watching after this one, and which I'll leave linked on screen and below, and in the end cards at the end of this video. Jane is unique amongst Henry's wives for several reasons. She was the only one who died on the job, having not been abandoned by him first. She was the only one to give him a surviving son. She was the only one buried with him, and she was the only one to be openly remembered by him after her death, for she continued to appear in portraits, including the famous Whitehall mural and the Family of Henry VIII picture, years after her demise, frozen in time even as the other figures in the painting aged. Some have argued that these factors combined make her Henry's favourite wife, though I'm not sure I really believe in him having favourites at all. I think apart from Anne of Cleves, they were all his favourite at one point or the other. I can tell you though that she isn't my favourite. Personally, I've always found the way in which she walked over Anne Boleyn's dead body to get her husband to be deeply disturbing. While I know she was being coached by her family and the anti-Anne faction at court to help her do this, I also think she was complicit, and while she didn't necessarily know that it would all lead to Anne's death, it still leaves a very bitter aftertaste in my mouth. My question of the day, therefore, is what do you think of Jane? Am I being too harsh on her? Was she actually the blameless, pliable little pawn she presented herself as, and what happened to Anne was all the fault of others? Let me know your opinions of her below, and remember that to hear more about her death and burial, I strongly recommend this video next. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.